Welcome to EdTech Live. I'm Steve Hargadon, and the interview you are about to hear was recorded on August 3rd, 2006, with Jim McQuillan and Eric Harrison. Jim leads the open source LTSP project, and Eric is the chief organizer of the K12 LTSP distribution. This was a great interview, however the sound quality is not the best. Tonight's interview is brought to you by TechnologyRescue.com, helping schools and businesses implement Linux thin client technology. TechnologyRescue.com. At the beginning of the interview, I asked Jim to give a short history of LTSP. What does that mean? How did it start? And where is LTSP headed?
Well, you sure you got time for all that?
Oh, sure.
See, where did it start? We started in January of 1999. So, gosh, what's that, seven and a half years ago, if my math is right? We just had a problem to solve for a customer. They wanted to add a bunch of terminals or computers to people's desks to connect to an FCO open server system and an IBM AS400. And we looked at various methods, and we decided we really wanted to do something with Linux. And the idea of a thin client type approach really sounded great, but there was no place to go buy a Linux-based thin client. And we basically decided to try to build our own. So we searched the internet, found lots of information on how to do network booting, came across the Etherboot site, and really within about 3 hours of having the idea, we had a diskless Linux workstation running. So it seemed like a great idea. So we launched a pilot project. Set up 11 workstations for a customer. They loved it. It worked great with the AS400 and the FCO machine. And so that's really they were our first customer, and they're still our biggest customer using LTSP. They currently have 140 thin clients running off of one server, which is a pretty nice size. But at that point, it was just a solution for one customer. It was a one-off thing, and we demonstrated it at our user group here in Michigan. And one of the guys said, "Boy, you guys should put that out on the internet and see if anybody else is interested." And we did, and I think within a few hours, people were starting to download it. And it just kind of took off from there. So that's 7 years ago we did that, and since we did that, we've gone through several versions, and it's just been a heck of a ride.
So, Jim, why did that solve a problem for them? And for those who are unfamiliar with Linux Thin Client, what was unique about that?
Well, at that time, there were two issues. One of them was price, because at that time, price was a huge deal. Because to put in a Windows-based machine with all the software licenses and things we needed to make it connect up to the IBM and the FCO machine, we were looking at $1,350 per desktop. And that's a pretty steep investment. They wanted 35 workstations. That was a lot of money. So we thought we could do something. Our target was $500 per desktop. We didn't need a hard drive. We didn't need a whole lot of things that a full PC needed. We didn't need any software licenses with Linux. So that was kind of our goal to fix the price problem by going with Linux. Something we also, one of the great benefits we realized was the fact that it took much less support. We found out that 35 workstations, we kind of figured one full-time person to manage those 35 workstations. When you're running Windows, we kind of figured that's what it would take, at least one person. Now we found with 140 terminals, it's one person half-time working on this. So that's like a half a person to take care of 140 workstations. What does it take to manage 140 Windows machines? People-wise. So that, there's two benefits to doing that. So does that answer your question?
Jim, for those who are unfamiliar with LTSP, would you explain exactly what it is that's happening that's different from how a regular PC would work?
A regular PC normally would load the operating system off of the hard drive, it would boot up all those things into memory and run. And on a regular PC, you have all, especially on a Linux PC, you have all kinds of processes running. You have a male daemon running. You have several different daemons. A lot of times with a standard Linux installation, you'd have a web server running. You just have lots of things running. With a thin client, we stripped it all the way down as far as we could go, so that the only thing we want to have running is a kernel to manage the process, and an X server, which is what gives you the graphical interface. So we stripped it all the way down. That's how we can run on very small hardware. I tell people the smallest, the minimum hardware that it takes to run a thin client is anything with a PCI bus and 32 megs of memory. So, you can get a PCI bus on an old 48650. As long as you can get 16 or 32 megs of memory, you could actually use that as a thin client. You sure can't run Windows XP on that kind of hardware. You really can't run most of the Linux distributions on that kind of hardware, but you can still use it as a thin client. The way it works is when you turn it on, the BIOS searches the PCI bus for a boot ROM, for an expansion ROM. So if you've configured it properly, if you have a PXE boot ROM or an EtherBoot boot ROM, the BIOS will detect that, and it'll basically execute the code that's in that boot ROM. And that boot ROM code will initialize the network card and do a DHCP request to get an IP address and the name of a file to download. It'll load the kernel into memory, start it executing, and then it will mount the root file system across the network using NFS. So we mount the root file system across the network using NFS. The root file system is read-only, so that all the workstations come up the same root file system, and nobody's going to mess up with anybody else's root file system. There are some cases when you boot up a computer where you need to write things to files. For that, we use a small memory-based file system using TempFS. So each workstation gets their own temp directory, so they can write things to the temp directory, and nobody else will step on top of them. But in the case of our customer, we have 140 thin clients, all of them sharing the same root tree, and the root file system is on the server in a subdirectory, and it takes like 130 megs of space. So all the thin clients are using the same 130 megs. It really turns out to really be wonderful. Not very much overhead in terms of disk space. And for the booting, it's not very much overhead for the server to serve up the boot images for all those thin clients.
So, Jim, let's shift gears just for a second here, because having been familiar with Linux Thin Client now for a couple of years, I understood most of what you said, but I'm going to imagine that a lot of the people who are listening now or who download this webcast, for them, a lot of this is going to be unfamiliar territory. So let's shift a little to Eric just for a moment, and let's talk about K12LTSP, Eric, and what you've done to take this technology that Jim has developed and bring it into the classroom where those who might not be that familiar with Linux or with Thin Client can actually use it.
Yeah, well, I actually started off similar with Jim, that customer demand. Our main focus we had wasn't initially so much on monetary savings, but from the labor side. It's basically we found that it took a full-time person to keep just a single lab of Windows machines running in a high school. So we had many of our high schools got together and we started trying to tackle the problem, how to reduce this management. And I got assigned investigating thin clients. And shortly thereafter, I gave a presentation at Linux Expo Toronto in 2000, and Jim McQuillan happened to be out in the audience. And I mentioned thin clients. He came up to me afterwards and says, "Hey, you need to look what I'm working on." So I took a look at it and said, "All right, I work for you now." We went back and we did some test installs with a number of kind of our target audience, which people run labs in high schools. And we found that it was just too difficult for them to install, too many steps. They weren't familiar with, the kind of the low level, how to get all the pieces to fit together and get it to work. So what I ended up doing was taking LTSP and integrating it into the base distribution. So we initially started with Red Hat Linux, and now we're running on Fedora. So we take the regular, what you see, Red Hat Linux or Fedora, and I would basically pre-install all the LTSP software and configure all the various services that are required to get it to work. So the overall goal was that a person should be able to stick a disk in, boot off of it, bring up the operating system installer, and just click OK all the way through. And when they're done, they'll have a working terminal server.
Now, if I'm a teacher or an administrator to school, and I'm interested in this concept of Linux Thin Client, what do I need?
Well, the first approach, we typically tell people to start small and find some little niche need that they have. Like if you have a whole bunch of old machines laying around that you have no other use for, you need some library kiosk or something like that. And we recommend that they take especially if they're not familiar with Linux at all, start very small. A modest recent desktop that has a gig of RAM and a reasonably fast processor can actually be used as a server to boot 2, 3, maybe 4 old machines. So we've had a lot of instances where they wanted to start. They would start out with like library kiosks, where you take just a regular desktop, install K12LTSP on it, and then use a couple of the old machines as thin clients. Something that's very simple, something that people don't get too upset if it breaks, something just to get their feet wet. We recommend everyone who starts that they join the K12 OSN mailing list, which is, there's a link to it off the K12LTSP.org website. There's a number of different scenarios that people have used this technology and how they've got it in the schools, and it really varies kind of on a case-to-case basis. But the general recommendation is start on something small. Find some nice low-hanging fruit, something where there's a need that's not being served, and start there.
One of the things you can do in the schools that I've seen quite a bit is a lot of schools have a Windows lab or a computer lab run on Windows. So what you can do is roll in another server, and like Eric said, it could be a 1 gigabyte desktop machine if you want. Roll it into the lab and create boot floppies for your Windows machines. And these boot floppies, all they would have on them is Etherboot. So you load Etherboot onto the boot floppy, and when it's time to do a Linux lab, you just push the floppy into the drive, close the lever, and boot the computers, and they're running Linux. When the lab time is over, you reboot the workstations without the floppies, and they're back to being Windows machines again. So it's a great way to get in there without spending any money, and you can try things out.
So when I first saw this technology, and I'm sort of a domain junkie, I came home and registered the domain Used Computer Magic, because for me it was like magic to watch an old computer do what could be done in Linux Thin Client. So why don't we describe for those who are listening what in fact the user experience is like on the Thin Client. If I have a classroom of students and we've started a modest Linux Thin Client lab, Eric, tell us what the user experience is from the moment they sit down.
Well, the interesting thing about it is that although you're sitting at this really old, crufty computer, the applications operate at the speed of the server. So if you have a modest server these days, dual Xeon processors, couple gigs of RAM, fast hard drive, something you can buy for $2,000 these days, will give just an incredible desktop experience. And one of the interesting things about it in particular is that it's actually faster on the terminal than it is if it was a standalone computer. It's kind of counterintuitive, but up to a certain point, the more people you have using the system, the faster it goes. The resources are shared, so if you want to start an application up and someone else is using it, there's no startup time. You double-click on the icon and bam, it's already running. It just pops up on the screen and off you go.
And what's that desktop like? Is it like Windows? Is it like a Mac? Is it easy for a child to understand or a student to understand and use? Is there a learning curve?
We've had really good success rates, especially the kind of our pecking order in schools is the kids are the most savvy. They'll handle anything you throw at them. Then you have the teachers who pretty much like whatever it is they like and nothing else. And then you have the administrators who don't seem to like anything. And we actually started off at one of our schools. It was kind of fun. We had the district technology coordinator requested from the superintendent time for training. And the superintendent basically said, no, I don't want to do that. And he says, fine, you go first, and however much training you require, I get to give the rest of the staff. So the superintendent says, fine then, I'll do it without any training, and he did. And so when they had their meetings, the superintendent would say, hey, even a moron like me can do this. You know, we've the overall interface is very intuitive, and all the applications are very familiar. You know, we use OpenOffice, which has a very familiar look and feel to it. We use Firefox, which many people are familiar with. Generally speaking, most people aren't even really aware of it's a different operating system. We've had several instances where we set up email gardens at conferences, and we've had people kind of scrunch their eyebrows and say, what version of Windows is this? I'm not quite familiar. And many people don't know the difference.
Well, Eric, there's something that Paul Nelson has pointed out several times, and that is the users, the kids using the computers, they only need a few basic things. They need a word processor so they can write their papers. They need an email program so they can send their emails. And they need a web browser. That covers most of the kids' needs. And Linux and a chat client now, yeah, that's getting pretty popular. And on top of that, then you can do a spreadsheet, and you can do typing tutor and all those kinds of things. A Linux terminal covers that very, very well. And people just need to realize that it doesn't need to be Microsoft Word that they're using to type their papers. It can just be any old word processor. Microsoft is one of them. OpenOffice is another, and I don't even remember the names of some of the others. We had WordPerfect at one time. We had just a whole bunch of them. And the kids just need something they can use as a word processor. And I love it when Paul makes that point. It just, when I see that in the email list, I think, good, there he goes again.
So I asked a question I obviously knew the answer to, because I'm particularly in love with the user experience in Fedora Core or in Ubuntu or any of these distributions in which you can use Linux Thin Client. But I think that's a point well worth making, and it's a lot of fun to see that this is a user experience that's very rich and yet is taking place at an extremely low cost. So, Jim, is this a change the world technology? What is it about LTSP that really makes a difference?
Well, LTSP makes it easy to deploy lots of Linux on lots of desktops very, very efficiently. And it doesn't require getting rid of your old hardware. We've kind of driven that point into the ground, I think. You can run this on old hardware, on old computers that can't run XP or can't run, whatever operating system you want to put on it. But they'll make a great thin client. So in the case of schools, schools have their budgets are shrinking all the time. And they don't have the money to go out and buy new hardware to keep up with the latest operating system. They just have, just tons and tons of old equipment. And they can get more old equipment because companies are willing to donate their old 500 megahertz P3 with 256 megs of RAM. Because the companies can't even use those anymore. So they're willing to donate that to schools. So here's a case where a school can set up a lab or even outfit the entire school with terminals for really very, very little money. They might have to invest in a decent server, but they're going to need the server anyway if they went with Windows. But they can conserve that budget for other more important things. And frankly, I'd much rather see them spending that money on teachers and things like that than on computers. That's what's making the difference.
Yeah, and of course, from my perspective, the big difference also is not just reusing the old hardware, but the management costs.
Yes.
Brought up Paul Nelson earlier. Before we converted one of their high schools over to a pure Linux terminal server environment. Before we did that, and they had Windows desktops, he managed the technology for all but one class period per day. So he was almost a full-time just maintaining the computers. When we switched over to thin clients, that reversed. He supported the entire school by himself during one class period and then became a teacher for the remainder of the day.
So if this is such a great technology, why have not more people heard about it?
Oh, it's there's lots of reasons. It's marketing. We don't have Microsoft's budget for marketing. We do what we can by showing up at the occasional trade show. There's articles being written. I mean, Steve, you've written some wonderful articles trying to push the technology, but not everybody's had a chance to read it. A lot of people just don't like the idea of change. They're comfortable they're comfortable just re-imaging Windows machines all day long because that's what they know how to do. That's what they get paid for. Nobody's really put it in terms that they will understand. The budget's shrinking. We have to get rid of 2 teachers. That's just the way it goes. Well, if I was faced with that, I'd look for other ways to cut.
Yeah, I would actually make the argument that it is expanding. It's actually expanding much faster than I would expect, coming from the perspective of working in education. It moves very, very slow. That's just the way things are. And so I'm actually just actually thrilled at the rate of that this is being deployed throughout the world.
Well, so let's talk about that a little too, Jim.
Yeah.
Because certainly, while we may not see much of it in the United States, you can probably give us some great examples of pretty phenomenal growth outside of the U.S.
It's just fantastic what's going on. I love what's happening in the U.S. It's great. But when I visit places, I've been to Brazil, I've been all over Europe, I've been to Australia, and I've seen deployments of this. And it's just fantastic. I know some people in South Africa. This is one of the projects that Mark Shuttleworth is sponsoring. There's I'm not sure the exact number, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 250,000 students are benefiting because of, in fact, really because of K12LTSP, because of the work that I've done, plus the work that Eric's done. There's 250,000 children in South Africa who are learning to compete in the modern world because they have computer access. I see similar things in Brazil. In Brazil, one of the things I'm very, very proud of that kind of gives me goosebumps when I talk about this is the government-sponsored Telecentros project. These are cyber cafes throughout the state of Sao Paulo. There's 6,000 cyber cafes, each of them with 20 terminals and a server. That's 120,000 terminals set up around. Sao Paulo is a huge place. They have a population of like 22 million people. But there's 120,000 LTSP thin clients set up running software that I basically started writing for a customer here in Detroit. Never did I think that it would have an effect like that. And in Brazil, there are people who have email addresses. They have an email address. They don't have a street address. They're homeless people who are free to come in off the streets and use these thin clients because the government offers them for free. And they can make contact with their friends and relatives that they normally wouldn't have been able to do. And that's the kind of thing that just sort of gives me goosebumps when I think about it.
And I might mention that although our map is not complete, there is sort of the beginnings of a map of Linux thin client deployments at K12LTSP.com. .org, which is where you would go to find out about installing K12LTSP. But if you go to K12LTSP.com, we have started a map that allows people who are running Linux 10 Client to place themselves on the map, and for others to actually go see if someone near you is running Linux 10 Client, where you could go look at it and see. I mean, I think our estimates are that we've barely scratched the surface in terms of the actual number of deployments, but we have, I think, 400 or 500 deployments up on that map, and it does give some visual aspect to the growth of Linux 10 Client. Jim, so where is LTSP going from here?
Well, let's see where it's going. One of Scott Belneves and I do the bulk of the development of LTSP. We have a lot of people that help, a lot of people submitting patches, but when it comes down to really hunkering down and really working on it, it's Scott and myself. And then Eric, of course, he's out there in Portland kind of doing his thing and throwing me patches, and we're sharing a lot. But Scott and I kind of sat down a little over a year ago to really kind of decide what we were doing. Figure out what we're doing now and what we want to do. And one of the conclusions we came up with is we don't want the user experience to be diminished in any way just because they're using a thin client instead of a real full computer on their desktop. Well, that's a pretty tough challenge because if the application is running on the server and they're the student's sitting in front of a thin client, the application is coming across the network. Well, audio is the first challenge. Getting good, robust audio support across the network it's a challenge. Local device support, where you can plug in your memory stick and have an icon appear on the desktop. Even though the desktop software is running on the server, and you plug your memory stick into the thin client, there's a real challenge to make that work. Full motion video type things, playing movies, using a voice over IP client, using a SIP client or a Skype client or something, doing that across the network. It's a challenge. So we kind of decided we really want to be able to focus on working on those things. Those are the interesting things. For a long time, for even still now. So for 7.5 years, when we create an LTSP distribution, it includes everything. It includes glibc and bash and kernels and the shell, the bash shell, and it just includes tons and tons of code that all the distros are already preparing. So why do we need to be responsible for preparing glibc and everything else when the distros are already doing that? So we kind of decided it was time to look for a way to offload that so that we weren't responsible for that. So we get the distros to do it. Then we could focus on, we really call it the 95% split, where 95% of the stuff that we ship with LTSP, all the distros already ship. It's the 5% that makes LTSP special. It's the ability to run local devices and local audio and those kinds of things. So we really want to spend our time focusing on that 5%. And we wrote up a white paper on it. And this is something we call the McQuillan specification. So we wrote up this white paper, and about a week later, I had contact from Mark Shuttleworth saying, Jim, we'd really like to integrate LTSP into Ubuntu. This was February of 2005. Now, they had just come out with their first release in October of 2004, and for the next release, they really wanted to include LTSP. So that's when they contacted me, they contacted Eric, and we decided, okay, let's do it. And I pointed Mark to the paper that I wrote. And it's on our wiki.ltsp.org if you're interested in seeing it. So I wrote this paper, and I pointed Mark to it, and he said, that sounds like exactly what I want to do. Let's get some of my guys together with some of your guys, and let's figure out how to make it happen. So that was like the first, or it became the first implementation of the McQuillan specification. That's the new way of doing LTSP. And over the past year and a half, that's what the Ubuntu guys have been working very, very hard at. And meanwhile, we've still been kind of following the path of building LTSP the way we've always built it, kind of trying to keep up with, with the technology and keep things going. But we had a meeting with Mark Shuttleworth and their developers in Paris in June, and we came to the conclusion that the best thing for us to do now is we've seen Ubuntu prove that the new way of doing LTSP works. It's not perfect yet. It's like any open source software. You have to work at it and what they say, release early, release often. And that's kind of what they're doing. And they're fixing bugs and making it more feature complete. But we've decided that the next release of Ubuntu's LTSP and our LTSP coming from LTSP.org will be based on the same technology. So that's what we're working towards now. And what we really want to do is have Fedora do the same thing. We want to have Novell and SUSE do the same thing. We want Gentoo to do the same thing. We want to help them to integrate LTSP into their distro using their bits, using their glibc and their kernels and their everything, so that we don't have to be responsible for it. And we'll provide the 5% that makes it special. So that's kind of the direction that LTSP is headed. And I've been talking with Eric quite a bit about this, and of course Scott Balmes is involved in it, and lots of other LTSP guys are involved in it, and that's pretty much what we're doing. It's kind of the future of LTSP.
This is a good point to ask a question for those who are just becoming familiar with open source software. So, Jim and Eric, who pays the large salaries that you both draw for doing this work?
The huge salaries that we draw? In my case, I'm fortunate. I run my own small consulting company, and I make pretty good money at it. And I can be very flexible with my time. So if 1 week I need to spend an extra 20 or 30 hours working on something, at the risk of angering a few customers because I'm not getting their things done, I can devote to LTSP. I don't really draw a salary from LTSP, although we do have, when we started LTSP, it wasn't me by myself. I have a partner, Ron Kolcernian, who helped me start it. And when we saw an opportunity there, we thought, hey, we could sell thin clients. So we created a small company. I don't want to make this sound like a commercial, but it is a small company called DiscosWorkstations.com, where we sell thin clients. And that provides a little bit of funding for LTSP. Occasionally it provides money to, where 15 or 20 of us can go out to dinner at Linux World or something. And sometimes it provides some travel expenses and things like that. But it's really not much of a salary, but it does help provide the funding. So that's really the bulk of the funding for the development of LTSP is really our own blood, sweat, and tears. We're not doing this for the money. We're doing this for the passion.
I do about 90%. My time is volunteer. The other 10% is other duties assigned at work, since a large number of my school districts implement K12LTSP. But it's not anything that we've actually formalized. It's, they get the same support basically as everyone else does, off the mailing list.
Well, I think it's a great example of the desire to contribute, to bring value, and to do something that will make a difference in the world because you can do it. And certainly both of you have exemplified that. So we've got a few more minutes before we want to open the lines for any questions. If someone has listened to this podcast or broadcast and still felt a little bit like they didn't know where to start or what to do, Eric, why don't you give us sort of a 5-step method for getting started with K12LTSP. We'll put the website links down in the wiki for the broadcast. And if I were starting from scratch, what would I do?
What I would do is I would go to K12LTSP.org. It's actually, these days when you go there, it gives you pointers to 3 different websites. Once you get there, you click on the one that's on the left as I'm pulling it up. Hang on 1 second. Yeah, we go to K12LTSP.org. Then on the left side there is a link that says Enter K12LTSP. And from there, there's a link to download the software, and then there's a link for documentation and a link for joining the mailing list. Join the mailing list, which is very important, and basically just try the software out.
So like you said before, we're looking for what would now be a modest PC to start a small network. That server's going to need 2 network cards, right?
Correct.
Typically, and then we're going to need to have a switch and some cabling and some old PCs that we can try. Now, if we try this and we feel a little bit over our heads, can we, as a real beginner, get on that mailing list? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
And we can ask a question from the perspective of knowing nothing, and someone will help us?
Yes, that is the goal. Be as friendly as possible.
That's how we all got started. The example I like to use is anybody out in Maine. I'm sure they're familiar with David Trask. He's in the school system there. wasn't that many years ago where I was kind of chuckling to myself at the questions he was asking, the simple shell scripting stuff that he was obviously a newbie. And boy, you ought to see what the guy is doing now. And he started out as a complete fresh newbie, and he installed the software, got on the mailing list, started asking us questions, wasn't afraid to go out and try things, and he's contributing more than an awful lot of people at this point. And that's I think there's a little bit of that in everybody out there. I'd love to see people get on the list and say, hey, I'm new, I'm going to try this. Anybody have any suggestions? And that's what they'll get, is suggestions on how to set things up and help when they need it.
Jim, for what applications would you not consider Linux Thin Client right now?
Oh, I wouldn't run the games on it, the big games. I wouldn't try to run Quake or Doom or those kinds of things on it. It's hard to run the really rich multimedia applications. You can actually play a movie and watch it in a window, but if you really try to go full screen with a DVD, you'll just chew up so much of the network that it just won't be what you were hoping for. But if you're trying to do word processing, spreadsheets, web browsing, email, the basic tasks that everybody kind of has come to expect, it's a perfect way to go.
Eric, before we open for questions, any last special things you'd like to say about K12LTSP?
No, not offhand. I think we covered the most of it. Besides just it's just designed to work, and so people really shouldn't be afraid to try it, especially if they have never used Linux before. It's a good introduction.
That's terrific. We want to let everybody know that we are going to be holding another hour interview after this one with Daniel Howard, and looking specifically at an implementation of Linux Thin Client that's taking place in the Atlanta public schools, which should also give us an opportunity to ask some specific details about how you actually implement K12LTSP. So I'm going to go ahead and open the floor now for anybody who might want to ask questions. And you would do so in the Skypecast by indicating that you would like the microphone.
How do you respond to network administrators and network folks that have been using Windows and everything is wrapped up in that? I mean, how would you help a teacher who wants to switch over to K12 or the LTSP and start using that in their, and just take their old machines? I don't know if I've heard anything that's incredibly convincing, except that it's going to increase technology access. It's not going to cost anything. What about the network background? I feel skeptical, and I'm glad I feel that way, because I know that's probably how some of the network folks in schools are going to feel. Do we really want to perpetuate or keep using these old machines?
Yeah, there's two things. One is one of the school districts I work with don't like deploying any hardware unless it has a support contract. And the main argument is basically if it breaks, we want someone else to fix it. Well, a large part of what we've been doing in our schools is they use old machines. If they break, they throw them away, stick another one in, and turn it on. There's no configuration. All the configuration's on the server. So it hasn't been really much of an issue using older hardware, because if it breaks, you just grab another one, plug it in, turn it on. It doesn't require any technical skill. And the other piece is that we actually, the design of K12LTSP was specifically for some of our school districts where they tend to be a bit hostile. And so we basically try to make it as safe as possible for the network. It's kind of the idea between having two network cards, one that you plug into the local area network where the rest of the school is operating, and that network card is basically firewalled off. Then there's a second network card in there that runs the terminals. So the whole LTSP environment itself is isolated from the rest of the network. We've had cases when we first started deploying Linux as a server, not necessarily as a LTSP server, but we've had teachers go and playing with it, and they would like install Samba for the Windows networking, fiddle around with it, and they'll turn the OS level really high and basically hijack the entire school district network. And so we look for things like that when we design K12LTSP and try to mitigate any potential damage.
So just a quick follow-up then. I'm over in Texas, and I want to get started with K12LTSP. Do I have to do it all myself, or is there a consultant that I can call and bring in? Do y'all have like a network of consultants that school districts could call?
Could you hear that question, Eric?
Yeah, just barely. Are there consultants available?
Yeah, are there consultants available in some of the different states? Do y'all have a network established, or a place I can go to look at a network? I haven't explored the K12LTSP's website enough, but if I'm in Texas and I want to get started with K12LTSP, what should I do first? Just go to the website and try to do it myself, or how do I bring a consultant in to do this? Because if I don't have time to do this,
right. I actually myself haven't been following who's doing consulting. Like, I know that there are. Jim, do you remember any of the consultants who work on this?
Well, there are a lot of people out there that are doing this. And that's one thing that excites me is people building a business around this stuff that we provide. Steve, you're doing some consulting, aren't you?
Oh yeah, I was being careful, like you, not turning it into a commercial.
Yeah.
It's something
it's not a commercial, but yeah, really, the thing to do, I think, would be to post that question on the mailing list. And you can, some people hopefully in your area would chime up. We don't have a real formal network for linking consultants together, for passing leads on and stuff. It'd be a nice thing to do. We just haven't gone that far. If you go to the LTSP wiki, that's wiki.ltsp.org, there's a link on there for support. You can click on that, and I don't have it in front of me, so I don't remember exactly where the link is. But on there, there's a few places you can go for to get support. Some of it free, some of it paid. I'd love to see schools, spending money on hiring consultants, like Steve or like some of the other people I know, to be able to actually, get them up and running. I think most of the schools that I've encountered don't have the budget to spend on anything, especially when it comes to consultants. And usually it's a teacher at the school who kind of champions the project, and they go in there and they do it on their own, and they get it working. And then finally, the school district notices or the superintendent notices or something, and then things start to happen. And by that point, they've already got the technology figured out.
Yeah, well, a lot of what we see happen here as well is people just visiting nearby schools that are using the technology and seeing it before considering implementing it themselves. And there are quite a few in Texas. I can't remember exactly where they are off the top of my head. I remember Alan Hudson rings a bell.
Yep.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of commercial usage there as well. I know Dallas Airmotive or something like that. They have a huge. Yeah.
What I would do is I go to the map that Steve was talking about on the K12. Was it K12LTSP.com?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what it is, Steve? Go there and look at the map and see who else is deploying it in the Texas area. Texas is a big state, so that's a huge area. But look in whatever city you're in, and you'll see that there are some other people deploying it. And send them an email, give them a phone call. I'm not sure how much information. Everybody can leave it whatever information they want, but try and contact that person. But I think the K12 OSN mailing list is the first place to start for finding expertise in that area.
Jim, we started K12opensource.com, which is actually where people would go to find this particular interview as a wiki resource for the K12 community in terms of open source software. And we've noticed that a number of consultants have started to put up their information on that wiki geographically.
Excellent.
And I found that understanding Linux thin client really depends on understanding Linux. And so if you can find someone who knows Linux and is pretty well versed in Linux, they generally are really capable of understanding Linux Thin Client and then being very helpful. Because most of the hurdles pretty much past the initial ease of installation of K12 LTSP are just going to be general Linux questions more than they are Linux Thin Client questions.
Yeah, some of them are just general networking issues, and a lot of them are Linux issues, and a lot of them are applications issues. They want to know about the typing tutor programs or the reader rabbit or whatever. I don't even know what all software is out there that AIR provides, but general backup questions, and there's all kinds of questions.
So Daniel Howard on the chat room has mentioned also to look for local Linux users group, which is where you might find somebody who's familiar with Linux and also may be familiar with Linux Thin Client, and they're typically going to be very interested in helping.
Yeah, good point.
Good. Well, I don't think we have any other questions. Jim and Eric, we sure appreciate your time. Sure grateful to have you on. We think it's I personally think it's a great technology. Miguel doesn't have as much experience with it, but Miguel, do you want to take 2 seconds and just talk about that survey that you did?
Sure, and guys, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I'm very supportive of K12LTSP. I just wish I had more opportunity to use it in our large urban school district. We did a sort of like a thin client project, and Kissing Penguins out of Austin, Texas helped us out with it and set up 10 thin client machines. We had a great result or feedback from our students. 97% said that they could use that thin client machine to do most of their work. So that was very positive, and I wish we could collect more of that data and make it more available. I noticed that NewsForge has an article on Brandon Elementary, and I guess that's the Atlanta District School. So it's kind of neat to see that, but I almost wish we could just publicize more.
Getting the word out is what we need. Yeah.
Exactly. And I appreciate y'all showing up tonight.
Well, good. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break because we are going to bring on Daniel and William and Sean from the Atlanta Public Schools Project. I want to make sure that we've got them on the line. Jim and Eric, thank you. Sure appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.